The lights at Wembley Stadium blazed like 1,000 suns on a humid July evening in 1986. 72,000 voices sang in perfect unison, their hearts beating to the rhythm of rock royalty. But what happened next would become the most closely guarded secret in British music history. A moment so extraordinary that those who witnessed it were sworn to silence for decades. For the first time, the truth can be told. The night Freddie Mercury brought an entire stadium to its knees, not for a song, but for a queen of a different kind. The night when two British icons, one draped in yellow leather, the other in royal purple, share a moment that would change both their lives forever. What Freddie Mercury whispered to Queen Elizabeth II that night, and why the palace buried the story for 38 years, will leave you breathless. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our emotional stories about Freddie Mercury. The year was 1986, and Freddie Mercury stood in his dressing room mirror, adjusting the golden crown that sat atop his head, a theatrical prop that had become his signature. Outside, the roar of 72,000 fans shook the very foundations of Wembley Stadium. The Magic Tour was living up to its name, but beneath the glitter and bravado, Freddie carried a secret that threatened to crush him. Just that morning, his doctor had delivered news that made his hands tremble as he applied his stage makeup. The diagnosis was still fresh, unspoken even to his bandmates, but it hung in the air like a specter. "Darling, you look divine," he told his reflection, forcing his trademark smile. But his eyes betrayed him. They held a sadness that no amount of theatrical paint could hide. This might be one of his last times commanding this stage, and he knew it. As Brian made tune his red special in the corner, he noticed Freddie's unusual quietness. "Everything all right, Fred?" he asked, his intuition sensing something deeper than pre-show nerves. Freddie turned, his movement graceful despite the weight on his shoulders. "Just thinking about legacy, darling, about what we leave behind when the music stops." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Roger Taylor's drumsticks paused midair, and John Deacon looked up from his bass. They'd been brothers in music for over 15 years, and they could feel when something was different. 20 minutes to showtime. The stage manager's voice cut through the moment. Freddie straightened his shoulders, transforming before their eyes into the invincible showman the world adored. "Well then, let's give them a show they'll never forget," he declared, but his voice carried a determination that went beyond performance. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt final. The walk from the dressing room to the stage was a ritual Freddie had performed hundreds of times, but tonight each step felt weighted with significance. The corridors of Wembley Stadium echoed with the distant thunder of the crowd, a sound that usually energized him but now seemed a whisper of endings. He passed the familiar faces of roadies and technicians, each offering encouragement, unaware of the storm brewing in his heart. As they reached the wings of the stage, Freddie paused, placing his hand on the cold metal of the scaffold. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see the ocean of faces, the sea of lights, the massive stadium that had become his kingdom. "You know," he said quietly to Brian, who stood beside him, "I used to dream of moments like this when I was a boy in Zanzibar. Funny how dreams come true, just when you realize they're not forever." Brian wanted to ask more, but the opening music cue began. Freddie's transformation was instant and complete. The vulnerable man in the wings disappeared, replaced by the invincible Mercury, who owned every stage he touched. As he burst into the spotlight, arms spread wide, the crowd erupted in a roar that could be heard miles away. None of them knew that in exactly 47 minutes, their concert would be interrupted by the most unexpected guest in rock history. The opening chords of One Vision exploded across the stadium, and Freddie was home. This was where he belonged, where he felt most alive. But even as he commanded 72,000 people to sing with him, a part of his mind wandered to thoughts of mortality, of legacy, of what it meant to be remembered. Little did he know that fate was about to deliver an answer to those very questions in the most unexpected way. The universe was conspiring to create a moment that would transcend music, a collision of two worlds that would leave an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. 15 minutes into the show, as Queen launched into Tie Your Mother Down, something unprecedented began to unfold in the shadows of Wembley Stadium. In the VIP entrance, A convoy of unmarked cars arrived with unusual urgency. Security guards who had been casually monitoring the perimeter suddenly snapped to attention, their radios crackling with coded messages that sent chills down their spines. Purple Crown approaching. Repeat, Purple Crown approaching. It was a code that hadn't been used at a public entertainment venue in living memory. James Morrison, Wembley's head of security for 15 years, felt his mouth go dry. He'd handled rock stars, celebrities, and even minor royalty, but this was different. This was the code for the highest level of British royalty. His mind raced through protocols that existed only in dusty manuals, procedures that no one ever expected to actually use. Around him, his team scrambled into action, but their usual confidence was replaced by barely controlled panic. In the royal box, which had remained mysteriously empty despite being prepared earlier, a flurry of activity erupted. Red velvet ropes appeared from nowhere, arranged by protocol officers who materialized like ghosts. The box, usually just another VIP area, was being transformed into a space worthy of the crown. Nearby concert-goers began to notice the commotion, their attention torn between Freddie's electrifying performance and the unusual activity in the traditionally quiet section. The story of how Queen Elizabeth II came to be at Wembley that night would become the subject of palace intrigue for decades. Earlier that evening at Windsor Castle, the Queen had been hosting a state dinner for visiting dignitaries. But something had stirred in her, a restlessness that her staff had noticed building for weeks. Perhaps it was the weight of recent royal duties. Perhaps it was the music drifting across the summer air from a staffer's radio. Whatever the catalyst, she had made a decision that shocked everyone around her. One wishes to go to Wembley Stadium, she had announced to her private secretary, Sir William Heseltine, who nearly choked on his tea. The protests were immediate and vociferous. It was impossible, they said. No security preparation, no protocol arrangements, no official invitation. But the Queen, in that quiet but implacable way she had perfected over 34 years on the throne, simply repeated, "One wishes to go." Detective Chief Inspector Williams of the Royal Protection Squad was having the worst night of his distinguished career. He sat in the lead car, watching London blur past, his mind calculating the 1,000 ways a spontaneous decision could go wrong. Behind him, in the royal Bentley, sat the Queen, dressed not in state regalia but in an elegant purple evening gown she had changed into specifically for this adventure. "Your Majesty," he had pleaded one last time at the castle, "this is highly irregular." Her response had been a smile that was almost mischievous. "Inspector Williams, one has been regular one's entire life. Perhaps one evening of irregularity won't bring down the monarchy." As the royal convoy approached Wembley, the stadium's management was thrown into chaos. Phone calls flew between the venue and Buckingham Palace, each more frantic than the last. The palace press secretary was already drafting multiple contingency statements, trying to explain the unexplainable. How did one announce that the Queen had essentially gone AWOL to attend a rock concert? Meanwhile, on stage, Queen the Band was hitting their stride. Freddy, unaware of the drama unfolding in the wings, was in full command. He strutted across the stage in his iconic yellow jacket, the lights catching the sheen of sweat on his face. The crowd was his body and soul, singing every word back to him. It was during 7 Seas of Rye, as he spun in one of his characteristic moves, that he first noticed something was off. The crowd's energy was shifting, a subtle change that his performer's instinct picked up immediately. Sections of the audience were looking away from the stage, pointing and whispering. The Queen's arrival at the stadium was like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples through the massive venue. Staff members who had worked at Wembley for decades stood frozen, unsure whether to bow, curtsy, or simply get out of the way. The usual VIP entrance procedure was thrown out the window. This was uncharted territory. As Her Majesty made her way through the private corridors, accompanied by a minimal retinue, word spread like wildfire. The Queen was in the building. The actual Queen, at a rock concert. The impossible was happening. As 7 Seas of Rye reached its climactic finish, the atmosphere in Wembley Stadium had fundamentally changed. What started as whispers in Section A had become a wave of turning heads and pointing fingers rippling through all 72,000 attendees. Freddie, ever the consummate performer, felt the shift like a physical force. The unified attention he commanded was fracturing, splitting between the stage and something extraordinary happening in the VIP section. From his position at the microphone, Freddie followed the crowd's gaze. His eyes, trained by years of reading audiences, tracked the disturbance to its source. When he saw what, or rather who, was causing the commotion, his legendary stage presence faltered for the first time in his career. There, taking her seat in the royal box with a dignity that seemed to slow time itself, was Queen Elizabeth II. The stage lights caught the jewels in her tiara, creating a constellation of sparkles that rivaled his own theatrical glamour. Brian May, positioned stage left, noticed Freddie's sudden stillness before he saw the cause. Following his bandmate's frozen stare, Brian's fingers actually stumbled on the fretboard, something that hadn't happened since their pub days in the early 70s. He shot urgent glances at Roger and John, trying to communicate the impossible without words. The Queen of England was at their concert. Not just any concert, their concert. Here, now, watching them. The crowd's reaction was unlike anything in rock history. This wasn't the typical celebrity sighting that might cause a brief stir. This was seismic. 72,000 people seemed to hold their breath simultaneously. Some stood in shock. Others fumbled for cameras knowing their primitive flashbulbs could never capture this moment, and many simply stared, trying to process the collision of two worlds they never imagined would meet. Freddie's mind raced at lightning speed. Every instinct he had as a performer told him to acknowledge this moment, but every protocol he'd absorbed as a British citizen told him to ignore it. The royal family didn't get singled out at public events. They observed. They remained separate. They maintained the mystique of monarchy. But then again, Freddie Mercury had never been one for following rules. As the final chord of the song rang out, the usual script called for immediate transition to the next number. Instead, Freddie stood motionless, his silk shirt clinging to his chest, his breath coming in short bursts that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The stadium lights continued their programmed dance. But for everyone present, the only illumination that mattered was the unprecedented connection happening between the stage and the royal box. Roger Taylor, watching from behind his drum kit, would later describe it as watching two different kinds of British history recognize each other. His drumsticks remained suspended in air, ready to count in the next song, but somehow understanding this wasn't the moment. John Deacon stood equally frozen, his bass guitar suddenly feeling like an anchor keeping him from floating away in the surrealism of it all. In the royal box, Queen Elizabeth II sat with a posture drilled into her since childhood, spine straight, hands folded, expression neutral. But those close enough to see would later swear they detected something in her eyes that rarely appeared in public. Genuine curiosity, perhaps even excitement. She had broken every rule to be here, and now she seemed to be waiting to see what would happen next. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Stadium security was in barely controlled chaos, voices crackling through earpieces as protocols were debated and discarded. Should they continue as if nothing had happened? Should they clear the royal box from public view? The head of royal security looked to the Queen for guidance, but her attention remained fixed on the stage. Then, in a moment that would be debated by historians and fans for decades, the two queens locked eyes across the vast expanse of Wembley Stadium. It was a look that transcended the physical distance, the social chasm, the very different worlds they inhabited. In that gaze was recognition, not just of who they were, but of what they represented. Two people who lived their entire lives in the public eye, who understood the weight of always being watched, the burden of constant performance. The crowd remained suspended in this magical moment. 72,000 people becoming witnesses to something unprecedented. Then, Queen Elizabeth II did something that sent shockwaves through her security detail and would have scandalized every protocol officer in the Commonwealth. She raised her white-gloved hand in the smallest gesture, not quite a wave, more than a nod. It was acknowledgment. It was permission. It was, in its own regal way, an invitation. Freddie Mercury, the man who had conquered stages across the world, who had never met a spotlight he couldn't own, felt his knees go weak. But as the Queen's gesture registered, something shifted in his expression. The shock gave way to something deeper. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit hidden beneath vastly different crowns. What he would do next would either be the triumph or disaster of his career, but in that moment, with history holding its breath, Freddie Mercury prepared to do what he did best, the unexpected. For 3 seconds it felt like 3 lifetimes. Freddie Mercury stood motionless on the Wembley stage. Then, in a move that would have sent every Royal Protocol officer in Britain into cardiac arrest, he raised his hand to stop his bandmates mid-preparation for the next song. The gesture was small but decisive, and when Freddie Mercury made a decision on stage, the world paid attention. He stepped forward to the microphone, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual theatrical bravado. Instead, there was a tremor of genuine emotion that made 72,000 people lean forward as one. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, each word careful and deliberate, "we have been graced tonight with an honor I never imagined possible." The stadium, already quiet, seemed to stop breathing entirely. In the wings, Queen's manager was having what could only be described as a complete nervous breakdown. This wasn't any script, hadn't been discussed, wasn't part of any protocol. The liability issues alone were staggering. But on stage, Freddie continued, driven by an instinct deeper than business or propriety. "Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II has joined us this evening." The words hung in the air like suspended diamonds, beautiful and dangerous. The explosion of noise that followed was unlike anything Wembley had ever experienced. It wasn't just cheering. It was a primal roar of witnessing the impossible. Union Jacks appeared from nowhere, pulled from bags and pockets by fans who brought them to every show. The sound was patriotic, chaotic, and completely authentic. In her box, the Queen remained composed, but those nearest to her detected the slightest widening of her eyes, surprise at the ferocity of the public reaction. "Your Majesty," Freddie continued, and then executed a bow that was pure theater, deep, dramatic, with one arm swept wide, his stage crown catching the lights. It should have looked ridiculous, this rock star in yellow leather bowing to the monarch, but instead it was perfect. It was Freddie Mercury acknowledging Elizabeth Windsor, but it was also one kind of queen recognizing another. "Would you do us the extraordinary honor of allowing us to dedicate our next song to you?" Pandemonium erupted in the royal security detail. This was unprecedented, unscripted, and potentially catastrophic. The head of security was frantically speaking into his radio, trying to get guidance from the palace, but the palace was as stunned as everyone else. The Queen's private secretary looked like he might faint. This wasn't how things were done. The royal family didn't become part of the show. They observed from a careful distance. But in the royal box, something remarkable happened. Queen Elizabeth II, the woman who had navigated 34 years of rigid protocol and careful distance, made a choice that would define this moment. She inclined her head in the slightest nod, and this was the part that would be denied by the palace for decades. She smiled. Not the practiced royal smile deployed at thousands of events, but something genuine that reached her eyes and transformed her face. The crowd's roar reached decibel levels that threatened the stadium's sound equipment. Brian May, standing frozen with his red special, would later say, "In that moment, I understood what it meant to witness history, not the kind written in textbooks, but the kind that lives in the hearts of those who were there." Roger Taylor, never one for sentiment, found tears in his eyes. John Deacon, always the quiet one, felt the bass line for their next song completely leave his mind. Meanwhile, the palace machinery was in overdrive. Emergency calls flew between Wembley and Buckingham Palace. The press secretary was having heated negotiations with BBC executives, demanding that cameras be restricted, that footage be controlled. This breach of protocol could not be broadcast to the world. What was happening at Wembley would have to remain within those walls, a secret shared by 72,000 witnesses. But Freddie wasn't done. As the crowd's roar finally began to subside, he made another decision that would seal this moment in secret history. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice now stronger, carrying the authority of a man who had found his purpose. "This next song, I wrote it thinking about love that transcends time, about connections that define us. I never imagined I'd share in the presence of someone who understands the weight of carrying a nation's hopes. He paused, emotion thick in his voice. But perhaps that's exactly why you're here tonight. The Queen's lady-in-waiting would later confide to her daughter that she saw Her Majesty's hand tighten on her purse, the only outward sign of the emotion beneath the royal composure. The Queen had come to Wembley on an impulse, drawn by something she couldn't name. Now, facing this flamboyant showman who somehow understood the loneliness of the crown, she was finding more than entertainment. She was finding recognition. As Freddie moved toward the piano, the stadium held its collective breath. Whatever came next would be more than a song. It would be a communion between two people who understood that sometimes the greatest performances were the ones that revealed the truth beneath the costume. The lights dimmed. A single spotlight found Freddie at the piano, and 72,000 people prepared to witness a moment that would officially never exist but would never be forgotten. The opening notes of Love of My Life began to fill Wembley Stadium, but this wasn't the version anyone had heard before. Freddie's fingers on the piano keys carried a delicacy, a vulnerability that transformed the familiar melody into something entirely new. His bandmates had instinctively arranged themselves around the piano in protective semicircle, understanding without words that this performance required intimacy, not spectacle. As Freddie's voice rose into the first verse, something magical happened. The usual stadium acoustics, designed for power and volume, seemed to shift, creating a sense of intimacy impossible in a venue of this size. Love of my life, you've hurt me, you've broken my heart, and now you leave me. The words, always poignant, took on new meaning in this context. This wasn't just a love song anymore. It was a meditation on loss, on the price of public life, on the things sacrificed for duty. In the royal box, those close enough to observe would later swear they saw Queen Elizabeth II compose Mass Crack, just slightly. Her press secretary, Sir William Heseltine, would note in his private diary that he saw the Queen remove one white glove, an action so unprecedented he initially thought he'd imagined it. She touched her hand to her chest, just above her heart, a gesture so small and human it would haunt those who witnessed it. The crowd of 72,000 had transformed into something unprecedented, a single organism breathing in unison. The usual concert behavior, cheering, singing along, waving lighters, had given way to something approaching reverence. They seemed to understand they were witnessing not just a performance, but a conversation between two souls who rarely got to be human in public. Freddie's voice grew stronger as the song progressed, but it wasn't the strength of volume. It was the strength of truth, unknown to all but his innermost circle. His recent diagnosis gave every word a weight that cut to the bone. When I grow older, I will be there at your side to remind you how I still love you. The future tense was no longer a promise, but a prayer, a hope against the growing certainty that his time was limited. Brian May, standing close enough to see Freddie's face, noticed tears streaming down his friend's cheeks. In 15 years of performing together, through triumph and exhaustion, he had never seen Freddie cry on stage. But this wasn't performance anymore. This was confession. This was truth-telling. This was Freddie Mercury stripping away Mercury to reveal Farrokh Bulsara, the boy from Zanzibar who had found his home in British music. As the song reached its bridge, something extraordinary occurred. The Queen, Elizabeth II, made a gesture that would be debated in whispers for decades. She stood up, not the formal rising required by protocol, but slowly, deliberately, as if pulled by something stronger than royal training. Her security detail nearly had a collective heart attack, but she raised one hand in a subtle gesture that meant stay back. She stood there, a sovereign in purple, honoring a sovereign in yellow. The emotional electricity in the stadium was palpable. Roger Taylor, watching from his drum kit, would later say, "I've played before millions, but I've never felt 72,000 hearts break and mend simultaneously like they did in that moment." John Deacon found himself crying openly, not caring who saw. This transcended music. This was humanity recognizing itself across the artificial barriers of class and protocol. As Freddie sang the final chorus, he did something that would become legend among those present. He stood from the piano and walked to the very edge of the stage closest to the royal box. The security detail tensed, ready to intervene, but both queens, the one on stage and the one in the box, held them back with their mutual gaze. Freddie placed both hands over his heart and sang the final lines directly to Her Majesty. "Love of my life, can't you see? Bring it back, don't take it away from me, because you don't know what it means to me." In that moment, the subtext became text. This wasn't just about romantic love anymore. This was about everything these two figures had sacrificed for their public roles. The Queen for her nation, Freddie for his art. It was about the love of life itself, about the beauty and pain of living under constant scrutiny, about finding meaning in performance while yearning for authentic connection. As the last note faded, the silence that followed was deafening. 72,000 people held their breath, waiting. Then the Queen did something that would send shockwaves through the monarchy for generations. She brought her hands together and began to applaud, not the polite, measured clapping of royal approval, but real, heartfelt applause. And as she clapped, tears, actual tears, were visible on the face of the woman who had been trained since birth never to show emotion in public. The dam broke. The stadium erupted in an ovation that shook the very foundations of Wembley. But more than applause, there were tears. Thousands upon thousands of people crying openly, moved by witnessing something they couldn't quite name but knew was profound. Two people who lived their lives as symbols had found a moment of pure human connection, and everyone present had been transformed by witnessing it. As the ovation thundered through Wembley, something unprecedented was about to unfold. The Queen's equerry, Colonel James Patterson, approached the royal box with an expression of barely contained panic mixed with resignation. He whispered urgently to Her Majesty, clearly trying to dissuade her from something. But the Queen, still standing, still applauding, shook her head with a firmness that brooked no argument. She spoke a few words to him, and his face went from concern to utterly shocked. On stage, Freddie stood frozen, overwhelmed by the moment. His bandmates gathered around him, equally stunned. They had played for royalty before, but this was different. This was personal. Brian put a hand on Freddie's shoulder, feeling his friend trembling with emotion. "Fred," he whispered, "what do we do now?" But before Freddie could answer, they noticed movement in the royal box. The impossible was happening. The Queen was making her way out of the box, her minimal entourage scrambling to keep up. The crowd noticed immediately, and a gasp rippled through the stadium like a wave. Security personnel were in near panic, trying to form protective cordons while maintaining some semblance of dignity. The head of Wembley security was on his radio, his voice cracking. "She's moving. Repeat, Purple Crown is mobile. We need all units to form a corridor. Now." As news of the Queen's movement spread to the crowd, something beautiful happened. Without any coordination or instruction, the audience began apart, creating a pathway. These were rock fans, many in leather and denim, but they understood they were witnessing history. They stood respectfully, some bowing awkwardly, others simply staring in awe as Elizabeth II, Queen of the United Kingdom and Commonwealth realms, made her way through a rock concert crowd. Meanwhile, the palace machinery was in full crisis mode. The press secretary was on multiple phone lines, issuing threats and pleas in equal measure to media executives. This cannot be broadcast. This cannot be photographed. This is a matter of national security. But it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. Whatever was about to happen would exist in the memories of 72,000 witnesses, even if it was scrubbed from official record. Freddie, watching the Queen's approach, made a decision that was pure instinct. He walked to the edge of the stage and, in a move that would have horrified every protocol officer in the Commonwealth, he extended his hand down to help guide the security team to the best access point. His eyes never left the Queen's face, and what he saw there gave him courage, a mixture of determination and something that looked remarkably like excitement. A small, hastily cleared area was created at the front of the stage. The Queen's security detail formed a protective circle, but she gestured for them to step back slightly. She stood there, in her purple gown and jewels, looking up at Freddie Mercury in his sweat-soaked stage clothes and smudged makeup. The contrast should have been jarring, but instead it was perfect. Two different kinds of British royalty, meeting on equal ground for the first time. "Mr. Mercury," the Queen said, and her voice, though quiet, somehow carried in the hushed stadium. "One felt compelled to tell you." She paused, and for the first time in her public life, seemed to struggle for words. Your performance tonight, particularly that last song, touched one deeply. One recognizes in you something one has rarely seen. The burden of always being on, of carrying others' dreams and expectations. Freddie knelt at the edge of the stage, bringing himself closer to her level. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Your Majesty, I never imagined to have you here to share this moment. He paused, and with characteristic Mercury boldness, added, We're not so different, you and I. Different stages, different costumes, but the same way to crown. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, denied by the palace, but burned into the memory of everyone present. The Queen reached into her purse and withdrew something small. She pressed it into Freddie's hand, closing his fingers over it. Mr. Mercury, Freddie, one wants you to know that your music has been a private solace in difficult times. This belonged to one's father. He loved music, understood its power to heal. One thinks he would want you to have it. Freddie opened his hand to find a small gold coin, a sovereign from George VI's reign. His hand shook as he realized the significance of the gift. The Queen's father, the reluctant king who had found his voice to lead Britain through its darkest hour. The parallel to his own story, finding his voice despite the obstacles, was not lost on him. Your Majesty, Freddie whispered, his showman bravado completely gone, replaced by raw sincerity. I'm not well. The words came out before he could stop them. It was his deepest secret, shared with almost no one. I don't know how much time. He couldn't finish. The Queen's eyes softened with understanding and compassion. She reached out and briefly touched his hand. A breach of protocol, so severe it would have caused fainting in the palace halls. Then make it count, Mr. Mercury. Make every performance a gift. That's what we do, isn't it? We perform for them, but we live for the moments of truth in between. As she prepared to leave, the Queen did one more unprecedented thing. She turned to face the crowd and raised her hand in acknowledgment. The roar that followed was deafening. 72,000 voices united in a sound that was part rock concert, part patriotic fervor, and entirely unique. Then she looked back at Freddie one last time. God save the Queen, she said with the slightest smile, referencing both the national anthem and the Sex Pistols song that had scandalized the nation. Both of us. As the Queen made her way back to the crowd, Freddie remained kneeling at the edge of the stage, clutching the coin, tears streaming down his face. His bandmates surrounded him, creating a protective circle. They had all witnessed something that transcended music, fame, or protocol. They had witnessed two people, trapped in different kinds of public service, recognize and honor each other's humanity. The show would continue. It had to, but everyone present knew they had witnessed the real performance already. In years to come, the palace would deny it happened. Photos would mysteriously disappear. Recordings would vanish, and official records would show the Queen was elsewhere that evening. But for 72,000 people, the truth lived on. The night when Freddie Mercury and Elizabeth II met as equals, and in doing so, reminded the world that even legends need moments of genuine human connection. The coin would stay with Freddie until his final days, a tangible reminder that even queens, both kinds, sometimes need to step off their stages and simply be human. If this story touched your heart, remember, even legends face battles unknown to the world. Subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone who loves Freddie Mercury.